How long do you spend writing your progress notes every day? If it's over 30 minutes, you should check out Describe. Describe is a HIPAA compliant AI note taking software that I and many of my students use daily. It saves me 1 to 2 hours a day on my documentation around consulting, and I know it's going to save you more in counseling. Also, it customizes exactly to my own writing style. I recommend that every therapist give it a trial. It's free. Go to describemed.com to get started for free. Again, that's describemed.com to get started for free. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1201. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we help you build a thriving private practice you absolutely love. And man, we are just loving helping people in our membership community. If you're looking for some support, just people that can join you, maybe even one of our small groups or one of our trainings, you can get full access to that over at practiceofthepractice.com/membership. That's the place to go if you want to connect with other therapists that are building awesome private practices that they don't hate. We want to have both sides of that. We want to have the thriving side. You're doing well, you're rocking it out, you're attracting your right client, you got your money in order, and that you love it, that you show up, whether that's online or in person, and you say, I can't believe this is my world. I know that's what I felt in my counseling practice. And there's times when maybe it was thriving more and I kind of hated it. There's times I loved it more and maybe it wasn't thriving, but finding that sweet spot is what we want to help you do. Today we have Scott H. Young, who is a Wall Street Journal bestselling author of Ultra Learning. He's a podcast host, computer programmer, and avid reader. Since 2006, he's published weekly essays to help people learn and think better. His work's been featured in the New York Times, Pocket, and Business Insider, on the BBC, and at TEDx, among other outlets. He doesn't promise to have all the answers, just a place to start, and he lives in Vancouver, Canada. Scott, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, how'd you get into learning?
Yeah, I mean, that's a funny question because we're always learning, right? So I feel like I've always been interested in things. I think how I got interested in this space of like writing about learning, which admittedly is a little bit niche, was just that when I started podcasting, or blogging, I should have said, in 2006, I was a college student. And so it was like I was studying all the time. And so how do you study effectively? How do you handle your course load and deal with those kinds of issues were really central to my life. And quite frankly, it was probably the only thing that I could offer from a personal experience perspective, something on there. And it really stuck. And it ended up becoming kind of this business that I've been running for now almost 2 decades. And it's also been a real passion project. It's given me a chance to do some fun, interesting things that, normally wouldn't be part of someone's day job.
Yeah. I think that idea of learning as an adult, sometimes we don't really think of it as like a craft in and of itself. But it seems like you've really studied you've learned about the art of learning.
Yeah.
How did that journey begin to kind of go meta on learning, to say, I want to understand how to learn faster or better, or to do ultra learning, or to get better at anything?
Yeah.
Like, when did that switch for you?
Well, I think the first time I got interested in this was, so this is again going back to this kind of like 2006 internet culture. There was a lot of people I was sort of, either friends with or kind of distantly connected to who were doing these sort of self-directed learning projects. So people like Josh Kaufman had a project called the Personal MBA, where he wanted to try to like give himself an MBA education without spending all the money you have to spend to go to a business school. And Benny Lewis was someone who was also an inspiration for me. He was doing these projects where he was traveling around the world, learning new languages, and kind of like posting videos of the progress as it was happening. Steve Pavlina was another one. I mean, he was writing after the fact, but he talked about doing a double major in math and computer science over 3 semesters. And I think it just really appealed to my kind of where I was at the time, I just liked this idea that learning wasn't just something that you had to get through, but it was also this kind of puzzle. Like there was like sort of a code that like maybe there was a better way of doing things. And if you understood how it worked, you might be able to do it more effectively. And so that sort of got me started on some of my own projects. But I think now it's like, it's such a deep part of my life. It's kind of hard for me to imagine the opposite of like not being interested in it. So it's a little bit hard to
Hmm.
distance myself from it in some ways.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig into kind of the three ingredients you discovered in Better at Anything.
Yeah.
Um, Talk through kind of how you discovered those, but then also just
Yeah.
teach us how can we be better at anything?
Well, I mean, the first book I wrote, Ultra Learning, was very kind of personal. So it sort of touched on some of these projects that I mentioned and some of my own projects. And after I finished it, I was still interested in this topic, and I started kind of maybe somewhat ill-advisedly digging into the scientific literature, and then like multiple years later of reading just like hundreds and hundreds of papers and stuff, I really had this task to myself of like, okay, well, what does it all mean? How can I kind of synthesize it? And I think it is difficult to give a kind of overly broad picture of this because there's just so many different people with different research paradigms and perspectives. But the three sort of factors that seemed pretty universal, not only in practice in terms of successful pedagogy, successful learning methodologies tend to involve these three components, but also there was a lot of like interesting theoretical work kind of explaining why these components are important, were seeing, doing, and feedback. So seeing means learning from other people, meaning that we are a kind of cultural species, and most of what we know comes from other people. And so the degree to which you can accelerate that process, that ease of learning from others, can often determine how far you get. Doing, obviously, we need to practice to get good at things. But there's also all this interesting research showing that the right type of practice matters, that you can spend a lot of time doing something and not necessarily get much better at it. And then finally, feedback, because it's not enough to just do something and you get it perfectly. At least most of the time, that's not the way it works. Instead, you need to get sort of corrective information, not just from teachers, not just from peers or the people you work with, but from the environment itself. If you're running a business and you try some business strategy and then it doesn't work, you need that feedback signal from the environment. And so it depending on what thing you're learning, the three components may differ in their prominence and which one tends to be the obstacle depending on what you're trying to learn. But those three factors were pretty universal.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, for yourself, when you think about something that you've learned as an
Yeah.
adult, if you apply that seeing, doing, feedback, how has that looked?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways. So, like learning languages, for instance. I mean, the seeing part in this case is often listening or reading, but it is obviously you need to find out about the words. You need to find out about the grammar. You need to learn that from somewhere. And early on, that's can be from more structured resources. So you can get vocabulary lists, you can get flashcards, you can get a little book that teaches you Spanish conjugations, and then later, it's often coming from watching television, from having conversations with people. You learn little phrases, little quirks of the language. That's that seeing part. Then doing, you have to practice a lot. And this is often what's lacking in a lot of language classrooms, is that you sit and listen to the teacher and you do a few written exercises, but you don't get the sustained quantity of practice that research says is pretty important for fluency. And so this is one of the reasons why a lot of people, maybe spent high school learning Spanish in their classroom, and then they go on a trip to
Hmm.
Spain or to Mexico, and they can't get much past hola because they haven't done enough practice to feel fluent in it, which is different from simply knowing the language. And then finally, feedback. I mean, if you try some expression or some phrasing and you get a quizzical look, then you're getting some feedback right there. So it's not even just someone telling you, oh, you said this wrong, but even just seeing your communication hit little friction patches and stuff that allows you to adjust. Oh, maybe I'm saying this in a funny way, or maybe this is not pronounced correctly, or something like that. So that's just one example with languages, but really we could pick any subject and it would be the same.
Yeah, and I think that's why things like Duolingo, or other kind of apps have been so successful. Is it's so broken down and so
Hmm.
practical, and then gives you that immediate feedback, rather than just. I remember when I wanted to learn Spanish in high school, and I was taking a Spanish class. My grandpa gave me this like workbook. And there was no audio side to it or interactive side
Yeah.
at the time. Maybe you'd get a tape that you listened to, but it wasn't where you're saying it and then the technology says, no, you said that wrong, do it again, and
Yeah.
here, listen to it. Like where it's more agile learning. Um, for other areas that don't have an app, like the Duolingo, for
Yeah.
other areas that you want to learn, what does that look like for you or for people that you've heard from that have kind of studied your work, for how they're applying some of this methodology?
Well, maybe to pull it a little closer to home for your listeners here, but I mean, if you're running a business, if you're running some kind of practice, there is a real learning curve there, right? Because, especially if you have not spent all your time in school studying running a business, you've spent it, learning a professional skill, and then you have to go out in the world and like source clients and build a practice and learn things like marketing, which is everyone's favorite thing to learn. Then you can often be in this situation where you have to teach yourself some skill. It's very important to your life, but it doesn't have there, there's no Duolingo for it, right? There's no flashcards that you can do. And so here, I think in a lot of cases, the seeing part is really predominant, that knowing what is kind of the best practice for your running a practice is very important. And it can often be a little opaque. So it's often not clear, what you should be doing to get clients, for instance, what you should be, investing your money in. If you have like some budget to, spend on certain things and not other things, which things should you prioritize? And so I think here, the peer network that you form is really important. And so I know, obviously in a very different line of work, but in my business life, the people who are the most successful at learning business skills, obviously intelligence plays a role, but it's often not the people who are just on paper the smartest or who have the best credentials. It's the people who are very fluid connectors, and they're very good at like talking to people, because they get access to this information that often isn't written down everywhere. And that gives you this kind of, oh, okay, like work on this, or I need to improve this. And otherwise that can be very hard to sort of deduce from first principles or just from guessing if you don't have a lot of experience.
Mm. Now, when we think about just how people might apply this to their private practice,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, so we have this whole membership community, 200 to 300 members in it that are
Hmm.
all wanting to build a thriving practice that they absolutely love. So people that are just getting going, they haven't maybe even like started their website, all the way through mega group practices. Um, how can people apply some of this, to just learn and move faster? Like, so when I think about kind of that
Yeah.
question, one of the biggest things that gets in the way is just time.
Hmm.
I would say time and mindset. So setting aside time for things and seeing the importance of it, and almost viewing, if you've put work on marketing in your calendar like it's a client, you're not going to no show on yourself.
Yeah.
And then I think there's also kind of the mindset of moving out of just being a clinician, or moving just out of being a small group practice owner, but realizing you have to hand things off. If you
Yeah.
think about maybe barriers to people's learning, that should be addressed, what other barriers do you see that get in the way of people's learning?
Well, I think you hit on one too, is that often we have a certain comfort zone of skills or aspects of skills that we feel competent in. We have a lot of self efficacy, to use a word that I'm sure most of the listeners here have heard of before. But we have this kind of confidence in approaching certain skills, and maybe we don't in other skills that are just as important to our practice. And I think sometimes there can be this, I don't want to say rationalization, but there can be this kind of, oh, that like a marketing thing that I don't feel comfortable with, or that, getting a website set up that I don't feel comfortable with. We don't give it its proper emphasis because we don't feel confident about it, because we're not quite sure what to do. And so I think that's where the reframing can be really helpful. That if you don't see it as just like, oh, this is this kind of difficult task on my to-do list that I just got to get done, but this is going to be a little learning project for me. I'm going to learn like, okay, what goes into a good website, even if I'm not building the website myself, even if I'm outsourcing it. Maybe I'm, collecting some research, looking at some other people's websites, seeing what I like, what I don't like, learning a little bit about how the website building thing works. It could be a small project, but it could still be seen in that light, that, the goal is to learn about it. Or if it's how to market your practice, and that makes you feel very uncomfortable because you just want to deliver the service to people, you don't want to be out there hustling and doing things that you think are very self-promotional. Maybe the way to think about it is not, oh, I have to do this marketing task or I have to do this networking task, but maybe I should learn about this skill. Maybe I should learn more about how it works. What are the things that actually are effective? Just treat it as this kind of exercising curiosity, and that can build some of that self-efficacy so that it makes it easier to work on it. Because I do agree with you, time is often limited, and that's always the case. We're always having to prioritize what matters most, especially when you're running a business and there is, in theory, infinite amount of things that you can do. But I think sometimes we let our own feelings of competence color what we choose to work on. And so we choose to work on this thing because it, like answering emails or, going to this forum and, writing posts or being on Twitter, like that feels kind of safe. And so I'll do that with this little bit of time I have, whereas something that maybe is outside of our comfort zone that we don't feel as confident in, maybe sometimes we avoid it, even though it is more important and we should be prioritizing it.
Yeah. Listen, I didn't take insurance in my counseling practice because I had no idea how to handle it. The process of accepting insurance outside of a group practice can be tough, but most people looking for mental health care want to use their benefits to pay for sessions. If you're like me and you feel a little scared about taking insurance, or you just want to make it easier on yourself, and you're interested in seeing clients through insurance, Alma can help. They make it easy to get credentialed with major insurance plans at enhanced reimbursement rates. They also handle all the paperwork, from eligibility checks to claim submission and guaranteed payment within 2 weeks. Plus, when you join Alma, you'll get access to time-saving tools for intake, scheduling, treatment plans, progress notes, and more in their included platform. It's going to make it so much easier for your team, so you can spend less time on administrative work and more time offering great care to your clients. Visit helloalma.com/Joe. That's helloalma.com/Joe to get started. Now, when we start to work through some of these barriers, I guess maybe walk us through someone's learning process. So someone has never done marketing. They're
Right.
saying, I want to work on learning marketing in my practice so that eventually I can hand that off to someone else. I think it's smart to never, keep that hat on. But I think, some owners want to learn things before they hand it off. If you were to say someone was like working with you and they said, okay, in the next 3 months, I want to really learn marketing.
Yeah.
What kind of plan would you suggest they do? Like phase 1, phase 2, or like what would that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, my starting point for any learning project, could marketing, but it could be any skill, is what I call meta learning, which is this sort of idea of kind of drawing a map of what you need to learn so that you have some sense of, I don't know these things, but this is what's out there. And this is sort of what I would have to do to learn it. So, with a language, it's very easy because you can be like, okay, well, here's the words, here's the grammar, here's the pronunciation. I'm not good at these things, but this is what I would have to be good at, what I would have to practice to get good at it. For a skill like marketing, though, I think this map drawing process is even more important because if you don't know much about the skill, it's very difficult to know what even you should be practicing. So, again, to use this example of marketing, my first step would be to ask myself, okay, well, I should get a basic education in, for businesses of my kind, what are the marketing options? What are the things people do? So people do paid ads, people do word of mouth. Maybe you have some kinds of I don't know, promotional strategies. There's all sorts of different subdivisions within those. And it would be good to start off by learning what the options are, hearing what works for other people. So depending on the industry, I know industries where people almost exclusively grow their business through doing some kind of paid advertisements, and other businesses, they almost exclusively grow through word of mouth and client referrals and stuff. And so I think this is another area where, again, touching base with that community, seeing what other people are doing, getting this lay of the land. So the phase 1 would be sort of, okay, well, what is this marketing skill? What does it actually break down to? What are the different components? What are the different subtopics that I could learn? And then it would be, making a sort of a reasoned choice based on your goals, based on your resources and what you've learned in that first process of, okay, maybe I need to focus in on one of these. So if you decide you want to specialize in doing Facebook ads, for instance, then, okay, let's find a course on Facebook ads and go through that and maybe practice it. And I mean, at any of these points, you can off ramp onto hiring someone who will take over that goal for you. But I think generally speaking, it's easier to hire the more map drawing you've done. If you know nothing about marketing and then you just hire a marketer, I can say with personal experience from running a business myself, that hiring someone who's just generally good at marketing is going to cost you a fortune unless you have a very specific idea of exactly what kind of marketing they should be doing, and you can kind of guide them in ways that are productive. And so that's often true with a lot of these sorts of skills, that you don't need to be an expert to, hire someone to run Facebook ads for you, but you need to know a little bit about it. And so I think that's what we often want to accomplish with these sorts of short-term map drawing learning project efforts, is to know enough so that you could outsource it. And then, of course, if you just really get interested in it, maybe you're going to learn how to do it yourself, and maybe you're going to do it yourself for the first year or two until you really figure out what works for your business, and then you start outsourcing it. So that's another option as well that some people pursue.
Awesome. Now, would love to talk just like a little bit about ultra learning and
Sure.
kind of what from that best applies to kind of counseling. I'm thinking about, you got your typical therapist kind of sitting in the room. There's always with these kind of interviews, the individual therapist knowing themselves and growing, but then also them learning things that they then transmit to their clients. Let's start with that individual therapist as a person, but then also I'd love to move into how can they apply this to their clinical work with their counseling clients.
Well, the basic idea of ultra learning was that taking on a self-directed learning project where you pick out a skill that you want to get better at, or a body of knowledge that you want to master, and then you design it. You design kind of the curriculum. Obviously, you can borrow other people's curriculum, but you design the curriculum, and then you work on it in your own time, and you choose it, is an effective option for a lot of people. And I think especially people who might be listening to this right now that are like, well, yes, I mean, I could go back and do some kind of business education or do this kind of thing, but maybe I don't have time for that, or maybe it's going to be a lot of skills that are not really necessary to where I'm at. Whereas if you design your own kind of approach to learning, you can really tailor it to exactly what you want to get good at. So this is sort of the general framework in the book. And so there's lots of different places that could apply. You could apply it towards any of your own self-improvement kind of goals. You could apply it toward if you want to learn more of the research in certain fields of therapy, like maybe you're a specialist in a particular kind, but you want to branch out, you want to study other kinds of types of therapies, maybe you want to get better grasp on maybe some of the scientific research behind it. You could be looking at, again, we just talked about it, these sort of auxiliary skills for actually running the business and doing that kind of thing. I mean, even just things like, okay, I want to be a better communicator in some way, and then you sort of narrow that down to like, I want to be a more empathetic listener, and so you focus your project on that. I mean, really the choice is yours. You can kind of design almost anything you want, and the book was really just sort of to try to drawing on some of my examples and other people's examples, like what are kind of the basic steps that you should think through in designing such a kind of project.
Now, tell me about your own work when you're deciding to do a podcast, or like take me through that process of thinking through coming up with podcast topics. I mean, writing a white paper every single week, like that's just like a lot of content to create and come up with. What's your process look like?
I mean, I've got different processes for different kinds of work. So for books or for longer length things, we also teach courses as well. Like a lot of that is, doing a ton of research, a lot of broad reading. And then when you feel like, you've got enough, something's ripe there, putting in there. So for me, I feel like just kind of continually learning, even if the learning is not aimed at anything in particular, is very important. It's digging the well, so to speak. You need to dig deep before you can start drinking the water out of it. And I think that's true of a lot of intellectual work, that you have to spend a lot of time laying the foundation. So that's what I'm doing often when I'm doing the kind of longer form content. With the essays, some of that is a similar effort. You read a book and then you're like, this is a really good book, I'm gonna review it or talk about it on my blog or my newsletter. But sometimes it's also driven by this kind of back and forth dialogue with readers. And so, I get a lot of interesting questions, and then in my sort of thinking through how I'm going to reply to this person's question, I'm like, you know what, I should put a few more periods and semicolons here and turn this into an essay that will be good for other people. So I don't know. For me, yeah, it's almost a hard question to answer because I've been doing this sort of for the last 20 years. It's kind of a reflex at this point to just be like, oh yeah, that would make a good essay. I should jot that down.
Mm. Yeah, I think that there's something about just saying you're gonna like do ongoing content, and so
Yeah.
us doing this podcast 3 to 6 times a week, depending on how many
Hmm.
sponsors and guests we have. Um, I think that for me, it removes the overthinking sometimes, where it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I could have read all of your books in prep for this, but if I did that for 5 to 10 interviews a week, I would not have a life. I
You'd
would
be
not
very
hang out
well
with my
read.
kids. Yeah, I would be very well read with
Too well
no
read.
act
Yeah.
time. Yeah, no time to like put any of it into action. And I think that also
No, I
for
hear
me,
you.
just realizing that kind of beginner's mind entering into interviewing people, for me, I value that, because if I
Hmm.
know too much, then the audience is like, what are you talking about? I haven't read this book yet. And so, but even just like
Yeah.
saying, okay, like how does it work for me in regards to this flow? And then once you kind of get into it, then it's just conversations with people. And so I think when you dig in deeper, it does take away some of that just overthinking sometimes. Do you find that too when
Yeah.
you're writing every single week and you're doing all these podcasts?
Well, just to add to your point about, having 6 guests on a week and then therefore not being able to read every single piece of content each guest has written. I think sometimes there can be an advantage to that because I've definitely found it's not always the case, but you can definitely get on podcasts where someone really did want to do their research and then you kind of end up just like walking through the different sections of your book, which is fine.
Right.
I don't have any problem having that conversation, but sometimes it destroys a little bit of like what was the natural impetus for talking about these things in the
Hmm.
first place. Like what is the kind of, realistically you should be able to have a naturalistic conversation about the things that you're interested in without like, oh no, you need to study this first before we can talk about it. So I mean that can be very helpful, but I mean I don't know, I think I find this similar kind of tension in my own work because I do like research driven stuff. I like things where, quite frankly, people don't like to read as many dry books as I do. And so it's, I think that is one of my areas of comparative advantage that I can like sit through dusty textbooks and then be like, okay, here's for the person who wants the 10-minute version, here's what I think matters. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of just kind of almost sort of philosophical about it where you want to rely on your everyday observation and common sense when you're doing things and not everything has to be a literature review and a meta-analysis, but having that kind of personal voice, and hopefully people will see that when they you've thought clearly about something, and you have that's why people come and not just for the citations.
Yeah. Now, I know a lot of people will probably resonate with you being more analytical, more kind of on the educational way that you present, a
Yes,
lot of this learning.
a little bit,
I
yeah.
mean, because lots of these folks have master's degrees, PhDs, they're really good at trauma, anxiety, whatever.
Hmm.
And then it's really hard for them to pull out their phone and like do a TikTok. They're just like, it doesn't feel aligned
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
with my counseling clients. It doesn't feel aligned with my expertise. And but writing a 10-page white paper
Mm.
definitely could be something that they feel is a little bit easier. What suggestions do you have for them in regards to like taking wherever they're at and just producing something that goes beyond their counseling practice?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question about how you can get someone's expertise and bring it to the everyday person. I think one of the challenges that people who are genuine experts, as opposed to dilettantes like me, when you are a genuine expert, you have such a deep and broad knowledge base in a particular field. It's very difficult to step back from that and be like, okay, what does the typical person actually know about this? And I think a common mistake that many writers make, many people who are expert communicators make, is they mistake an audience's lack of knowledge over their particular subject with just being unintelligent or ignorant in some ways. And so I think you can sometimes see this, especially with maybe some heavy-handed public health messaging where they don't really trust the audience to have any kind of sophistication in like being able to understand, okay, well, I'm telling you this is why I'm telling you this. That's going to be too complicated. I can't tell you that. I think I think the way you have to treat the audience is with respect, and respect for the fact that, you know what, they are often smart. They're maybe much smarter in a different field than you are, and you just have a lot more knowledge that they don't have. And so that kind of, I think that starting point of respect and being like, this person's busy, maybe they don't have a lot of time to sit through a lot, but maybe I've learned something that's important that can be communicated to them. And I think if you can start from that kind of place of mutual respect, it's a lot easier to do that communication. And I know it can be frustrating at times when you see people posting misinformation or bad theories, and then they get like a million retweets or shares or whatever. And you're like, why aren't they listening to the experts? But I think it's just because it's very difficult to see what's plausible or what's a good answer to certain questions unless you have that expertise. And so being able to try to bridge that gap, I think, is very important. And even though I'm not the academic expert for a lot of these fields, I have a lot of respect for people that try to do that, and I really do, in my own way, try to bridge some of that gap a little bit of trying to respect the people that you're talking to and give them something that might be useful, given the fact that they maybe don't know nearly as much as you do.
So awesome. Well, the last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
Well, I would want them to know that they can learn the skills that seem frustrating and difficult for being successful, not just as a, communicator or therapist, but for their business and for what they're working on. And I think there's lots of ways you can do that, but it has to start with that self-belief of, if I wanted to, if I dedicated the time, I could become an excellent public speaker, or I could be excellent at public communication or marketing or accounting or building a website or all of those things. And I think if you start from that base of curiosity and confidence, there's really nothing you can't do.
So awesome. If people want to get your books, if they want to connect with you, where should we send them?
Yeah, so they can check out my website. That's scotthyung.com, SCOTTHYOUNG.com. And I have thousands of free articles, free ebooks, things like that there. And there's also links there to my 2 books, Ultra Learning and Get Better at Anything, which you can also find on Audible, Amazon, wherever you get your books.
So awesome. Thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I am excited for you to go learn or try something new. It was a number of years ago that I decided to switch from acrylic paint to watercolor paint, because I swear, like, watercolors, they were always just like a big mess. And so I spent some time watching a bunch of videos and some techniques, bought some good paints instead of those like crappy ones I had as a child. And now watercolor is what I really enjoy. Over on my personal Instagram, I post all sorts of art on there that I just play with. It's really interesting how when you don't feel like you have to create something for someone else, you just try new stuff, and it turns out often cooler than I would have planned. I've talked lots of times about doing improv. So tonight, at the time of this recording, it's a Tuesday. Every Tuesday I go do improv. Sometimes I even teach. So throughout most of the fall, I was teaching and I was participating. So like 4.5 hours of improv every Tuesday. But that lights me up. Go find those things that light you up, that just make you enjoy life differently. And when you do that, come tell us how it went. I'd love to hear some of those stories. We have a lot coming up, and over in our memberships over at practiceofthepractice.com/membership. Make sure you check that out. If you are not in the memberships, you are missing out on the community that's going to help you get to the next level. Thank you so much to Alma for being our sponsor today. I wish Alma had been around when I had my private practice. I had no idea what I was doing. That's why I didn't take insurance. But if Alma had been there, I would have. And there's no reason that as a clinician, you should be spending hours on paperwork to bill for insurance, or not knowing for sure that you'll get reimbursed for sessions with your clients. If you're interested in seeing clients through insurance, but don't want to navigate the process and paperwork on your own, Alma can help. They make it easy to get credentialed with major insurance plans at enhanced reimbursement rates and a guaranteed payment within 2 weeks. Visit helloalma.com/Joe. That's hello, ALMA.com/Joe to get started. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.